"Get away from my car." She said it without looking at him. Her eyes stayed on the phone in her hand, her thumb scrolling, the screen casting a pale light across her face in the parking garage. He didn't move. I said, "Get away." She finally looked up. "Security can remove you." He reached into the pocket of his worn canvas jacket and set a small envelope on the hood of the Mercedes. The one registered in his name, the one she drove every morning, the one she had told her mother he'd bought for her because that was simpler than explaining anything else. "There's something in there you should read," he said. She stared at the envelope the way someone stares at a problem they've already decided not to solve. Then she pressed a button on her key fob and the car chirped and she walked around him and got in without picking it up. He stood in the parking garage for a while after her taillights disappeared. He didn't feel anger exactly. What he felt was something more like recognition. The sensation of finally seeing a thing you had suspected for a long time but had chosen, again and again, not to look at directly. What he didn't know, what Serena Voss had no way of understanding as she drove away from the man she believed was barely getting by, was that the envelope she left sitting on the hood of a car she thought was a gift contained a single printed page showing the majority ownership stake of Creston Capital Group. 4,700 employees across 9 countries. $2. $3 billion in managed assets. And one name on the signature line. His name. So why did Serena Voss walk away from an envelope that would have changed everything she thought she knew? If you're new here, this is where real stories live. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Let me go back, because none of this makes sense without it. Marcus Creston had grown up understanding one specific truth about money, that people who had it were never fully sure why anyone else was close to them. His father, a man named Gerald who had built a regional logistics company across 31 years of 4AM, mornings and decisions made by gut feeling, had told him this on the night Gerald signed the papers selling the company for $74 million. They were sitting at the kitchen table in the house Marcus had grown up in. The one with the yellow linoleum floor and the drawer that never quite closed, and Gerald had set a small brass compass on the table between them. A compass that had belonged to Marcus's grandfather, a merchant sailor who had navigated by instinct as much as instrument. "You'll have more than I did," Gerald said, "and the hard thing about more is that you'll never know, for certain, why people show up." Marcus was 26 then. He hadn't fully understood it. He understood it completely by the time he was 32, which was 18 months after a woman named Patricia, his first serious relationship following the expansion of Creston Capital into its second fund, had sat across from him at a dinner party, learned through mutual friends what he was worth, and visibly recalibrated everything about how she looked at him within the space of 4 minutes. He watched it happen in real time. He felt something harden in him, a door swinging closed, and he made a decision that night that he held to for the next several years. The next person he allowed close to him would know Marcus the man first. Marcus the logistics consultant, the one who drove a 7-year-old truck and wore canvas jackets and didn't talk about his work at dinner parties. The wealth would come later, when trust had already been established in the absence of it. This was not, in practice, a deception. He never told anyone he was poor. He simply did not volunteer the truth and lived, in his daily life, with the particular minimalism of someone who genuinely preferred things that way. His home office was sparse. He ate at diners. He had a tab at a hardware store 2 blocks from the building his company owned. The employees who reported to him in the office knew. Obviously, his attorney, Oliver Reed, knew. His 2 oldest friends knew. But in the ordinary texture of his daily life, Marcus looked like a man who was comfortable but not wealthy, the kind of person no one looked at twice. He met Serena at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning in late October. She was arguing good-naturedly with a vendor about heirloom tomatoes, and she had a laugh that arrived without warning, a short and genuine thing that he noticed from 2 stalls over. He bought a jar of honey he didn't need in order to get close enough to introduce himself. She was a graphic designer with her own small studio, practical and direct, with opinions she expressed without needing you to agree with them. On their first 3 dates, she paid for herself without discussion. On the 4th, she made dinner at her apartment, actual cooking, with mise en place and a real grocery list. And he brought the wine and they talked until 2 a.m. about her father, who had been a teacher, and what that had done to her sense of what mattered. He was drawn to all of this. He was drawn to the version of her that didn't know what he was worth. They dated for 11 months before he gave her a key to his apartment. He told her he worked in financial consulting and that his schedule was irregular and that he traveled frequently for client meetings. All of this was true. The precise nature of the clients and the scale of what he managed, these things he held back, not as lies but as deferred information, waiting for the moment when it no longer mattered because the relationship had already proven itself. That moment he would eventually understand never quite arrived, because before it could, other things arrived first. The shift in Serena did not happen all at once. That is the thing about erosion. It happens in increments so gradual that each individual moment seems survivable, even unremarkable, until you look back and realize that the person you're standing next to is not quite the person you were standing next to 12 months ago. The first increment was her mother. Diane Voss had always treated Marcus with a particular brand of polite neutrality that just barely concealed its actual content. She had Serena's eyes but none of her warmth, and she had very clear ideas about what constituted a suitable life for her daughter, ideas organized almost entirely around financial category. The first time Marcus met her at a Sunday lunch Serena hosted, Diane had asked him within 8 minutes what his income bracket was. Not in those words, she phrased it as interest in his sector and trajectory, but the architecture of the question was unmistakable. He answered honestly, naming his consulting work, declining to specify figures, and watched Diane's expression do the small recalibration of someone marking a box on a private ledger. After that lunch, Serena was quieter in the car. He didn't push. 3 weeks later, Diane hosted a dinner. Her husband, Serena's stepfather Roger, was present and largely silent, the way men become when they've been married to a loud certainty for too long. Also present was Diane's close friend and her friend's son, a man named Colton Page, who arrived in a charcoal suit that fit the way charcoal suits fit when someone has paid to have them fitted, and who drove a white Range Rover with the kind of confident inattention to where he parked it that spoke of a man who was not worried about door dings, because the concept of inconvenience had been sufficiently insulated from his daily life. Colton was 36. He said he was in private equity, which could mean anything, and in his case meant access to enough surface vocabulary to sound sophisticated at dinner parties without needing to explain specifics. He had a watch, a Patek Philippe Ref 5x726 steel, which retailed at approximately $65,000 and was the kind of watch that only means something to people who know what it means, but which Colton wore with his left wrist angled outward with the consistency of someone who had practiced this. He mentioned in passing a trip to the Maldives. He mentioned a colleague's yacht in the same sentence as the word borrowed in a way that implied access rather than ownership while still conveying access. He was seated next to Serena at dinner. Marcus was seated next to Diane. He watched. He was good at watching. He had spent years reading rooms as a professional function, assessing what people wanted before they said it, understanding the difference between what was being performed and what was true. What he watched, over the course of 2 hours and 3 courses, was Serena's attention shifting in the small ways that attention shifts when something new has entered a frame that had previously felt complete. She didn't flirt with Colton, she was too self-aware for that, and Marcus was present. But she asked him questions, genuine questions, the kind she asked when she was actually interested. And she laughed at things he said with a fraction more energy than she usually gave to things she found funny, the way you laugh when you're slightly performing being present. Driving home, she said, "He seemed interesting." "Sure," Marcus said. "You didn't think so?" "I thought he was practiced," Marcus said. "There's a difference." She looked at the window. "Maybe, but he's obviously successful." "There's nothing wrong with that." He didn't respond to this immediately, because the sentence was not wrong on its surface and he had learned over years that the impulse to respond to every surface truth was rarely productive. What he noticed and filed was the particular emphasis she had placed on obviously, as if success that was not visible, not performed, not announced, did not quite register as real. The following 4 months were a study in gradual recalibration. Colton Page reappeared at Diane's house twice more, once for her birthday dinner, Once for what Diane called a small gathering that turned out to be 14 people, including a city councilman and a local news anchor. Each time, he was better dressed than Marcus and louder in the particular way that sounds like confidence until you've spent enough years around actual confidence to understand the difference. Each time, Diane found natural moments to compare, noting what neighborhood Colton had recently moved to, mentioning a charity event he had sponsored, once producing, seemingly by accident. A photograph in a local business magazine that featured Colton at what was described as his investment fund's annual reception. Marcus watched Serena receive all of this with the expression of someone who was trying to sort a feeling she hadn't yet named. She had values, he knew she had them because he had watched her act on them. Had watched her turn down a lucrative branding contract with a company whose labor practices she found objectionable, had watched her spend 3 weekends volunteering at an adult literacy program. The woman he had fallen for would have looked at Colton Page and felt faint suspicion. But Colton Page kept appearing in rooms where her mother was, and her mother kept providing narration. And narration, applied consistently enough, eventually becomes the story. By the time they had been together for 2 years and 3 months, Serena had begun making comments about their apartment. His apartment, technically, though she stayed there most nights, in a register she hadn't previously used. Small things. The kitchen could be updated. The building lobby was dated. A colleague of hers had just bought a place in the Riverside district, which she mentioned with a specificity that suggested she had spent some time thinking about what that cost. She had begun, twice, conversations about long-term plans with a preamble that included the phrase "people at our stage," meaning financial stage, in a way that assumed a financial stage they did not, as far as she knew. Occupy, he listened to all of this. He did not yet show his hand. Then, on a Thursday evening in March, he came home to find Serena on the phone with her mother, standing in the kitchen with her back to the door. He had let himself in quietly, his habit, not a strategy, and he stood for a moment longer than he should have before she heard him and turned. He had heard enough. "He tries," she had been saying. "I know he does. But Mom, there's a ceiling. You can feel it." A pause. "Colton isn't, he's just different. He operates at a different level." Another pause. "I'm not saying anything, I'm just saying I understand now what you mean about potential." She saw Marcus. Her expression moved through 3 things in less than a second. Guilt, correction, recovery. "I'll call you later," she said to the phone. He set his bag down on the counter. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator's hum and the distant sound of traffic through a window she'd left open 2 inches. "How long?" he said. "Marcus, how long has she been talking to you about Colton?" "It's not what," she stopped. Started again. "She thinks he'd be a good connection. Professionally, for both of us." "A connection," he said. "You could use one. Someone with his reach you could." "You've been telling her I need help?" he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at the counter. "I've been telling her the truth about where things are. That's not a crime." He didn't answer that. He picked up his bag and went to his office and sat at his desk in the dark for 40 minutes. His grandfather's compass in his hand, he kept it on the desk. A habit formed so early he no longer noticed it, turning it over the way you turn over a fact you're not sure yet what to do with. He thought about what his father had told him. He thought about the 11 months before she had the key, the 2 years and 3 months since. The version of himself he had chosen to present and what it had allowed him to observe, and he weighed what he had observed against what he had also genuinely felt, which was real enough that it complicated everything. He called Oliver Reed at 8:30 that night. "I need to know something," Marcus said. "If I wanted to run a real test, not a conversation, not an ultimatum, an actual, concrete test of what someone's priorities are, what would that require?" Oliver was quiet for 4 seconds. Oliver was always quiet for exactly as long as it took him to formulate a precise answer. No shorter, no longer. "It would require," Oliver said, "that you be willing to accept whatever result it produces." "I'm aware," Marcus said. "Then tell me what you're thinking," Oliver said. The plan they developed over the following 2 weeks was, in its basic architecture, straightforward. Marcus would spend 4 weeks in a deliberately visible form of financial difficulty. Not fabricated hardship, but a removed comfort. He would give the Mercedes to the building's secondary garage and drive the old truck. He would wear the clothes he genuinely owned from before the wealth, the canvas jackets and worn boots that had always felt more natural to him anyway. He would tell Serena, without specific explanation, that a major client dispute had created a temporary cash flow disruption, true in the sense that it was a plausible business event, deliberately vague in the specifics, and that he was working through it. He would observe. He would not intervene, interfere, or reveal anything until he had a clear answer to the question he needed answered. He did not tell Serena any of this. What he told Serena on a Sunday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee he'd made in the old drip machine he'd dug out from the back of a cabinet, was that he was in a difficult patch professionally, a client dispute, some restructuring. He wasn't sure yet how it would resolve. He said it plainly, without drama, watching her face. She nodded, said she understood, said these things happened. She lasted 9 days before she called her mother. He knew this because he was in the next room when she called, though she didn't know it. And because the conversation had the particular rhythm of a call that had been building for a while and had finally found its moment. He didn't hear every word. He heard enough. He heard, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this." He heard the word potential again. He heard, unmistakably, the sound of a person who was using a call with their mother to arrive at a decision they had already made. 3 days after that call, Colton Page appeared at the coffee shop 2 blocks from Serena's studio. Marcus knew this because Oliver Reed had, at Marcus's request, and with considerable professional restraint, positioned someone to document what could be documented from public spaces. Nothing intrusive, nothing illegal, just timestamps and locations and a camera that could see what was visible from a sidewalk. The meeting lasted 41 minutes. Colton paid. They walked out together and she touched his arm once, briefly, at the corner, before they went in separate directions. That was the moment Marcus understood that this was no longer a test of values in the abstract. This was a test that was producing a result. He went home and sat with the compass for a long time, turning it over in his hands the way his grandfather must have turned it over on a ship's deck, trying to find true north in conditions that made it difficult. Then he called Oliver Reed again and told him it was time to start building something more formal. Part 2 Oliver Reed kept an office on the 14th floor of a building downtown that had the particular quality of expensive understatement, nothing flashy, nothing branded, just well-maintained wood and the kind of silence that comes from thick walls and serious work. When Marcus arrived the following Tuesday at 7:30 in the morning, Oliver was already at his desk with 2 folders open and a legal pad covered in the dense, organized handwriting of a man who processed information by writing it down in full sentences. "Sit," Oliver said, not unkindly. Marcus sat. "What do we have so far?" Marcus asked. "Enough to be methodical," Oliver said. He turned the legal pad toward Marcus. There was a timeline on it, handwritten, with dates and notations. "Let me start with what I found when I started looking at Colton Page the way you asked me to. Because there are 2 separate problems here, and they're not the same problem even though they've been running alongside each other." Marcus looked at the legal pad. He already felt, in the way that people feel things they have been partly expecting, that this was going to be worse than he had prepared for. "The first problem," Oliver said, "is that Colton Page has been positioning himself with Serena for a reason that has nothing to do with Serena specifically." He opened the first folder. Inside were printed pages, email screenshots, a corporate filing record, a financial document with a highlighted section. His fund is structured in a way that's been under SEC informal review for 14 months. Not a formal investigation yet, but it's building. He needs a new access point. Specifically, he needs proximity to a capital management operation that isn't already on the radar. Someone mentioned your name to him 8 months ago at an industry event. We confirmed that with 2 separate sources. Marcus looked at the document. The highlighted section showed Colton Page's fund name and, 2 lines below it, the words associated capital relationships sought in language that was deliberately imprecise. "He came after her," Marcus said slowly, "to get to me." "Through her," Oliver said. "Yes, he had no way of knowing you hadn't told her what you actually run." From his perspective, a 2-year partner of the CEO of Creston Capital would have, at minimum, influence, access information about timing and structure that could benefit someone trying to restructure their own exposure. He paused. He's been using her as a conduit to a resource he thought she could reach. And she, to be fair to her, has no idea. Marcus absorbed this. It did not make him feel better exactly, but it rearranged something, clarified the shape of the problem, which was different from solving it. The second problem, Oliver said, and here he opened the second folder, is that 3 weeks ago. Serena added a secondary name to the household account you share, a joint account that you set up for shared expenses, mortgage, utilities, the regular things. I know the account, Marcus said. The name she added is not yours, Oliver said. He set the page in front of Marcus. It was a bank document, the kind you request when you want to see the full authorization record. The secondary name on the account, added 22 days earlier, was Serena Colette Voss, which was Serena's full name, combined with a note in the authorization section that read unrestricted withdrawal access. Marcus looked at this for a moment. She already had access to that account. She had co-signatory access as a household account, Oliver said carefully. This new authorization gives her unrestricted independent withdrawal access, meaning she could drain the account without notifying you and without a co-signature. As a standalone action, it's not necessarily fraudulent, but timed against everything else we're looking at, she was preparing to leave, Marcus said, and she was preparing to take something with her when she did. Oliver nodded once, without embellishment. Marcus looked at the compass he had brought with him, sitting on the edge of Oliver's desk where he'd set it when he sat down. His grandfather had navigated literal oceans with it. He had used it, in his own life, as a reminder that orientation was possible even when the conditions made it difficult. Right now it looked like a small brass thing that had been in too many hands over too many years, worn smooth in the places where palms had held it. "What's in the account?" he said. "As of Monday morning, $186,400, Oliver said. "It's been higher. She moved $23,000 to an account I haven't been able to trace yet, about 6 weeks ago. Small enough not to trigger automatic review." The number was not enormous relative to what Marcus actually controlled. But that was not the point, and Oliver knew it was not the point, and neither of them needed to say this. "How long do we have before she moves again?" Marcus said. "Unknown, but if she's planning something coordinated with Paige's timeline, we need to assume it could be soon." Oliver picked up his pen. "I want to propose a structure for the next 3 weeks. Tell me," Marcus said. "We freeze nothing yet. We document everything. I've already retained a forensic accounting firm, Gentry & Associates. Marissa Gentry specifically. She worked a similar case for a client of mine in 2019, and she's meticulous." He wrote the name on a fresh page of his legal pad. "Marissa will trace the $23,000 transfer. I'll monitor the household account on a 48-hour reporting cycle. And I want you to maintain your current posture. No confrontation, no revelation, nothing that suggests you know anything, for at least 2 more weeks. Can you do that?" Marcus thought about the parking garage, the envelope on the hood, the taillights disappearing. He thought about how he had felt watching those taillights and what he had named that feeling, which was not anger but something more structural, the feeling of an architecture you believed in being revealed as load-bearing in ways you hadn't accounted for. "I can do that," he said. "Then go home," Oliver said. "Act like a man who is worried about a client dispute and nothing else. Let me and Marissa work." Marissa Gentry arrived at Oliver's office 3 days later, at 8 in the morning, with a leather briefcase, a flat expression, and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent years being precise in environments where imprecision has consequences. She was in her late 40s, with reading glasses that she pushed up onto her forehead when she was thinking and down onto her nose when she was working, and she had, Oliver had said, an almost pathological attention to the story that numbers tell when you put them in the right order. She sat across from Marcus and looked at him for a moment before she said anything. "I've seen the initial documents," she said. "Tell me one thing I don't know yet." "What would that be?" he said. "The target," she said. "Not what she took or what she plans to take. I understand the financial shape of that. Tell me what she actually wants. Because people who do this," she gestured briefly at the folder, "almost always have an end state in mind that isn't just money. Money is the vehicle. What's the destination?" He thought about this honestly. "Legitimacy," he said after a moment. "She wants to be seen in a certain context. Her mother has been defining that context for years, and the context requires a specific kind of visible success. Colton Page performs that visibility better than I do because I've actively chosen not to perform it." He paused. "I think she decided that what she believed I was, my ceiling, she called it, wasn't going to get her where she needed to arrive." Marissa absorbed this without visible reaction. She wrote something on a small notepad she kept separate from any official file. "So the money isn't the goal," she said, "it's the starting capital." She was using the shared account as a resource to fund a transition. She looked up. How does Paige fit in? Does she know what he actually needs from her? "No," Marcus said. "That's the one piece she doesn't have. As far as Serena knows, Colton is interested in her personally. She has no idea that what he actually wants is access to what she believes I don't have enough of." "Which is an extraordinary irony," Marissa said, without inflection. "I'm aware," Marcus said. "All right," she closed the notepad. "Here's what I need 3 weeks to build. I want a complete transaction history on the shared account going back 30 months. I want to identify every transfer that went anywhere other than the standard household payees. I want to trace the $23,000, which I believe I can do within 10 days given the account routing. And I want a separate analysis of Paige's fund structure and how it interlocks with any entity that could have directed funds towards Serena's new account. Because if he's been seeding her transition fund, that's a different category of problem than what she did on her own." Oliver, who had been quiet through this, said, "We also have the Creston Capital angle to consider. If his intent was to use her as a conduit to gain access to Marcus's fund structures, that's securities fraud territory," Marissa said flatly. "If I find evidence of that, you'll need securities counsel, not just civil." She looked at Marcus. "Are you prepared for that to become a larger matter?" He thought about the 4,700 employees at Creston Capital. He thought about the senior managers who had been with the company for 8 and 10 years, who had families and mortgages and retirement accounts that had existed because the fund had been managed conservatively and carefully. He thought about the operations manager in the Dublin office who had sent him a handwritten note when he'd approved the expansion there, thanking him specifically and earnestly, a gesture that had stayed with him because it had been so entirely without strategy. "Yes," he said. "I'm prepared for that." "Then let me work," Marissa said. She picked up her briefcase and her glasses came down to her nose, and that was the end of the meeting. Marcus maintained the posture Oliver had asked for with a discipline that cost him something real. He came home in the evenings to the apartment where Serena still spent most nights, cooked dinner in the kitchen where she had once made him a meal that had lasted until 2 in the morning, and talked about small things. A film she'd seen, a difficult client at her studio, the weather moving toward a late spring that the city needed. She was warmer with him than he might have expected, which he understood after some thought as the warmth of someone who has made a decision and therefore feels less conflicted, not someone who is reconsidering. She asked, twice, about the client dispute. He said it was ongoing. She nodded with the expression of someone who is listening but has already placed the information into a category and moved on. On the 9th day of this period, she came home later than usual with a lightness he recognized as the particular lightness of someone who has had a better day than expected outside the home. She made tea and sat on the couch and looked at her phone and smiled at something. A message, a photo, something, with the unguarded expression of someone who forgot for 1 second to manage what their face was doing. He noticed. He said nothing. He went to his office and sent Oliver a text message that said only, "Timeline may be shorter than we thought." Oliver replied in 4 minutes. Marissa found the $23,000. It went to a new individual account in Serena's name at a different institution. She also found 2 additional transfers, $8,400 and $11,000 from the same period. Total moved, $42,400. And there's a Page connection, a payment from an LLC registered to him made to a consulting entity that has Serena listed as a sole proprietor. Amount, $15,000. Dated 6 weeks ago. Marcus read this message twice. He set the phone down on his desk. He picked up the compass. He looked at it for a long time, the worn face, the needle that always found north regardless of what surrounded it, the small reliability of a physical fact in a context that had become complicated beyond what he had initially anticipated. His grandfather had trusted it on open water, in weather, in conditions where you couldn't see where you were going. The point was not the destination. The point was that you knew what direction you were facing. He put the compass in his jacket pocket. He went back to the living room and sat beside her on the couch and watched a film she had put on, and he stayed completely still inside. The way you stay still when you know that what comes next requires every last degree of composure you have ever built. 12 days remained before the event Oliver had identified as the right venue. The invitation had arrived, as so many of the right invitations did, through channels that meant something to people who understood what those channels were. The Alderman Foundation's annual spring reception, a black tie fundraiser for arts and literacy organizations attended by approximately 200 guests, hosted at the Alderman Hotel's Grand Ballroom, and this year co-chaired by none other than Colton Page, who had managed to position himself on the committee in the same way he managed to position himself at Diane Voss's dinner table. Through surfaces, through the performance of access, through making himself legible in rooms where legibility was the currency. Serena had mentioned the event 3 weeks earlier. Diane had told her about it. Apparently, she had said she might like to go. Oliver had confirmed, through 2 separate channels, that Colton would be there in his co-chair capacity. He would be, by the structure of the evening, visible at the front of the room and at the reception tables and at the podium, introduced by name, acknowledged for his contribution. Marcus had accepted the invitation without telling Serena he would be attending. She believed he wasn't going, not because he lied, but because she hadn't asked and he hadn't volunteered. He had arranged, through Oliver, for something else to be there as well, a simple folder, on a table near the ballroom entrance, containing documents that would only be meaningful to the right people at the right moment, assembled with Marissa Gentry's characteristic precision. 11 days. 10. 9. He waited. Part 3. The Alderman Hotel's Grand Ballroom had the quality of a room that had been designed to make everyone inside it feel as though the occasion mattered. The ceiling was high and gilded, and the light came from fixtures that cast a warmth that was neither harsh nor dim, and the round tables were set with linen and glassware that caught it all. 200 guests in formal dress moved through the pre-dinner reception hour with champagne flutes and conversations that had the specific energy of people who were being seen and knew it. Marcus arrived at 7:14, 11 minutes after the reception began, wearing a dark suit he owned but rarely used, the compass in his jacket's breast pocket where he always put it when he needed to feel oriented. He did not take a champagne flute. He stood near the room's south wall and found what he had come to find, Serena, at a table near the front, beside her mother and Roger. And 1 seat over from Colton Page, who wore a tuxedo and had the watch on his left wrist with the practiced outward angle, and who was leaning toward her with the posture of a man who had already decided how the evening was going to resolve. Oliver Reed was near the entrance, in conversation with 2 people Marcus didn't know. Oliver caught Marcus's eye once, briefly, and gave the smallest possible nod. Marissa Gentry was not in the room. She didn't need to be. The dinner was called at 7:45. Marcus took a seat at a table near the back, on the aisle, with a clear sightline to the front table. He watched dinner unfold the way you watch something you have been watching for a long time, with a tension that has passed through anxiety and arrived somewhere more settled, a low and focused steadiness. Colton Page was introduced as co-chair at 8:20. He spoke for 4 minutes, smooth, rehearsed, the language of someone who had given this kind of speech enough times to have worked out where to pause for effect. He thanked the foundation. He said something about the importance of community investment. He mentioned a commitment his fund had made to literacy programming, a number he cited as $400,000 over 3 years, which Marissa's documentation showed had not yet been fulfilled beyond its first $50,000 tranche. The room applauded. Serena applauded. Her mother applauded with the particular satisfaction of a person watching something they arranged arrive at its intended conclusion. Marcus watched. At 8:52, Oliver stood and moved to the front of the room with the quiet authority of a man who moves through spaces as though he belongs in them, which he did, because Oliver Reed had been a member of the Alderman Foundation's legal advisory board for 9 years, and his presence there tonight was entirely natural. He stopped at the co-chair table. He set a folder down in front of Colton Page. Colton looked at the folder the way a person looks at something unexpected in a context where unexpected things should not be arriving. He looked at Oliver. Oliver said something too quietly for the room to hear. Colton opened the folder. Marcus watched him read. He watched the precise moment when Colton Page understood what he was holding. Not the first page, which was a summary in accessible language, but the second page, which was Marissa's analysis of the LLC payment to Serena's consulting entity, cross-referenced against his fund's SEC informal review filing. The moment arrived like a door closing. Colton's posture changed by half an inch, a drawing in, the body doing what the face had not yet processed. Diane Voss, seated beside him, looked from Colton to the folder to Oliver with the expression of someone who had not been told this was part of the evening's program. Serena looked up. She found Marcus's face across the room. Her expression moved through confusion, then recognition, then something that could not be named in a single word. The particular combination of seeing someone where you did not expect them and understanding in the same instant that this means you have misunderstood something important about the arrangement. Marcus stood and walked to the front of the room. The room had not fully registered that anything unusual was happening. The conversation at other tables continued. The servers moved with trays. The general noise held. Only the front table was still. He stopped beside Oliver. "Colton," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I think you've met my attorney." Colton looked at him. Something moved through Colton's expression that was not quite composure and not quite its opposite. It was the look of a person running rapid calculations. "I don't think we've formally," Colton began. "We haven't," Marcus said. "You know my name from a different context. Marcus Creston. Creston Capital Group. The fund you've been trying to access for 8 months by cultivating someone who, as it turns out, did not have the access you believed she had." He said this with complete flatness, the way you state a fact that requires no performance to land. Diane Voss made a sound, not quite words, more the preliminary sound of someone whose controlled certainty has encountered friction. "Marcus," Serena said. "The folder in front of you," Marcus continued, still looking at Colton, "contains a summary of a payment your LLC made to a consulting entity registered to Serena 6 weeks ago. Timed against a series of transfers from a household account she and I shared. Oliver's office has the full documentation. The SEC's informal review of your fund structure, which has been ongoing for 14 months, is also referenced. Specifically, the section that documents your stated need for new capital access relationships, which is a very precise way of describing what you were doing." The table had gone silent enough that the nearest adjacent tables were beginning to notice. Colton set the folder down on the table. He looked at Marcus with the expression of someone who has been playing a long game and has just had the board inverted. "You've got this wrong," Colton said. His voice was still controlled. He was better at this than most people would be in this situation. "Which part?" Marcus said. "Silence, I thought so," Marcus said. He looked at Serena. Her face was open in a way it hadn't been for months, all the management gone, just the actual thing underneath. "The envelope I put on the car," he said. 3 weeks ago. In the parking garage." She stared at him. "Did you read it?" She looked at the table. A silence of 4 or 5 seconds. "No," she said. It came out smaller than she probably intended. "That's what I thought." He reached into his breast pocket and set the compass down on the table in front of her. Not dramatically, just set it down, the way you set something down when you need both hands. "I'm going to find Oliver and get some water. You can read the folder if you want. It's yours." He walked away from the table at a measured pace, into the middle of the room, and did not look back. Diane Voss said, at a volume she had not calibrated for the sudden silence, "What does he mean, Creston Capital?" "The consulting, he's in consulting." Colton said nothing. The watch on his wrist caught the gilded light and he put his hand below the table. Serena sat with her hands flat on the tablecloth and looked at the compass her mother's chosen man had not noticed, and that Marcus had carried in his jacket all evening, the small brass thing that had been on a merchant ship and then on a kitchen table and then on a desk and was now here, turning its face toward north. Oliver came to Marcus's side at the water station near the service entrance. He handed Marcus a glass. "It held together," Oliver said. "Yeah," Marcus said, "the room is processing it. The 4 tables nearest the front have mostly understood that something happened, not the specifics." "That's fine," Marcus said. "I didn't need the whole room." "What did you need?" Oliver asked. Marcus drank his water. "I needed her to know that I saw it," he said. "And I needed Colton to know that I know what he was doing, and that the documentation exists, and that what happens next depends on him." "And Diane?" Oliver said. Marcus considered. "Diane will process this in whatever way Diane processes things. That's not something I can control. He set the glass down. How long until Marissa files with the SEC formal inquiry channel? 72 hours, Oliver said. Unless you want to change that. I don't, Marcus said. Let's get some air. They walked out through the side corridor, past the coat check, and stood for a moment in the cool night outside the hotel's side exit, the city sounds surrounding them at a normal volume after the artificial hush of the ballroom. Part 4, The Unraveling of Colton Page, began not in a courtroom but in an accountant's office. 6 days after the alderman reception, when Marissa Gentry submitted a 47-page referral to the Sex Enforcement Division documenting the informal to formal escalation path for an investigation that had been technically pending for 14 months. The referral included, in its appendices, the complete LLC payment record showing the $15,000 transfer to Serena's consulting entity. Cross-referenced against internal communications, obtained legally through discovery channels Oliver had already positioned, showing that Colton's fund had identified Creston Capital as a strategic target 11 months earlier. The specific wording in those communications was methodical in the way that incriminating things are always methodical when you look at them afterward, structured. Deliberate, stripped of the kind of language that would signal intent to anyone reading casually but legible to someone reading forensically. Marissa read forensically. She annotated each document with the same dense handwriting that covered Oliver's legal pads, and her annotations made the story of what Colton had attempted visible the way a developing photograph makes what was always on the film visible. What Colton had attempted was this, through Serena, who he believed had access to Marcus's professional network and trust. He had planned to arrange an introduction at the level of Marcus's chief operating officer, a man named Duncan Frey, who managed Creston Capital's day-to-day investor relations, and through that introduction to negotiate a co-investment relationship that would have given Colton's fund the surface appearance of alignment with a legitimate, SEC-clean operation, which is the specific thing his fund needed to resolve its informal review before it became a formal investigation. He had paid Serena $15,000 in the form of a consulting engagement not because he required her actual consulting. She was a graphic designer, a skilled one. But nothing in the engagement letter described design work. But because a documented business relationship between them gave his access attempts a plausible cover story. He had, in other words, paid her to be the bridge to a man she didn't know was standing right behind her the whole time. When the SEC formal investigation was opened on a Thursday morning, Colton Page's fund suspended new investor activity the same day. His co-chair listing on the Alderman Foundation's website was removed within 36 hours. The white Range Rover disappeared from the building where he'd maintained a rented office space, which was vacated formally the following week. The keys returned by a person who was not Colton. The contents removed at some point during a weekend when no one was in the building. Colton himself was not publicly visible for the 3 weeks following the reception. His social media, which had been maintained with the consistency of a marketing operation, carefully curated images of charitable events and professional gatherings, and one prominent photograph of the watch against a background that happened to include what appeared to be a yacht's railing. Went dark the evening after the referral was filed. His attorney contacted Oliver's office and indicated that Colton would be cooperative with any formal inquiry process in language that Oliver recognized as the preliminary positioning of someone who has decided that cooperation is less costly than resistance. This was, Oliver told Marcus over the phone on the 4th day, the standard arc. Men like Page don't go down fighting, he said. They go down calculating. He's going to give the SEC something that reduces his own exposure, and whatever he gives them will probably point somewhere else in his fund structure. Someone below him will carry more of it than is accurate. That's how it works. Will the fund's investors be made whole? Marcus asked. Some of them. The SEC freeze on new activity limits how much more damage accumulates from today forward. The prior losses, if there are any, Marissa is still working through the fund's actual performance record against its stated returns. Those are a different question. How many investors? Retail investor pool in the fund, approximately 340 accounts, Oliver said. Weighted towards smaller amounts, mostly high net worth individuals in the $250,000 and under tier, not institutional. Colton's pitch was targeted at people with real money who weren't sophisticated enough about fund structures to ask the right questions. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Can we support the SEC process? Whatever Marissa has, make it available proactively? Already in progress, Oliver said. She sent a supplemental package yesterday. Good, Marcus said. The Patek Philippe watch, the reference 5726, steel, with the outward angled wrist had been, Marissa's investigation later revealed, purchased on a personal loan secured against the fund's general assets in a transaction that was not disclosed to fund investors. It had cost $62,400. The disclosure gap was one of 17 similar undisclosed personal expenses that the forensic review identified in the fund's general ledger over a period of 31 months. Each individual transaction had been small enough not to trigger automatic review. Assembled in sequence, they told a story about a man who had spent 3 years treating other people's money as a resource for performing a version of himself that would attract more of it. Diane Voss did not contact Marcus directly after the reception. Serena told him in the conversation they had 3 days later in the apartment kitchen. The one with the yellow afternoon light coming through the window, both of them standing on opposite sides of the counter in the way people stand when the furniture between them is doing structural work, that her mother had called her 3 times in the 48 hours following the ballroom. The first call had been disbelief. The second had been a recalibration. Diane working through the revised facts with the methodical efficiency of someone updating a ledger. The third had apparently included the phrase, "Well, I didn't know," spoken in the particular tone of someone who means I didn't know the specifics, while carefully not addressing the broader question of what they had known about the direction they were pointing their daughter. Serena relayed all of this without Diane's usual inflections. She looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been doing a great deal of internal work that doesn't show in any visible output. "How long did you know?" she asked Marcus. "About the account. 19 days, he said. She absorbed this. And the thing before that. Watching. The truck. The jacket. 4 weeks, he said. And the watching started before that." She looked at the counter. "I called you a ceiling," she said. "I heard," he said. She stopped. Started again differently. "What I felt was real. At the beginning, what I started to think you were, the ceiling thing, that was something I let her build for me, and then I started building it myself, because it was easier than pushing back on her every time. And then at some point, I stopped knowing where her story ended and mine started." She looked up at him. "That's not an excuse." "I know it's not an excuse." "No," he agreed. "The money," she said. "The transfers." I know what you were doing," he said. "I need to say it," she said. "I was preparing to leave. And I was taking something with me that I hadn't earned the right to take unilaterally. Even if I thought of it as shared, it wasn't mine to move without telling you." She held his gaze. "That was wrong. Specifically wrong. Not just a mistake." He said nothing for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. The same window as always had the same 2-inch gap at the top. "The $42,400 can be returned to the account," he said. "Oliver's already drafted the correction. He just needs a signature." "I'll sign it," she said immediately. "And the $15,000 Colton paid you?" "I didn't know what it was," she said. "I thought it was a real engagement. He said he needed brand identity work for a fund relaunch." She looked at him directly. "I believed him. I shouldn't have taken it without asking you why a man I'd met at dinner was suddenly offering me a contract. But I wanted to believe I was being seen for what I could do, not for." She stopped. "I believed him," she said again. "Marissa documented that your consulting entity performed no actual work under the engagement," Marcus said. "That's the sex reading of it. You may need to return the amount or cooperate with the inquiry." "I'll cooperate," she said. "Whatever they need. I'll tell Oliver," he said. There was a long pause. She reached across the counter and touched the compass which Marcus had set there when he came in, the same place it had been on the morning after the reception when he'd come home and put it down and hadn't picked it up yet, because he needed it to just be an object for a while instead of something he was holding for reasons. "His grandfather's?" she said. "My grandfather's," Marcus said. She pulled her hand back. "What does it mean to you?" He thought about this honestly. That direction exists even when you can't see it. That you can be in open water, in bad weather, without a clear horizon, and still know which way you're facing. He looked at it. "He left it to my father. My father left it to me the night he sold the company. I've kept it on my desk since then." She looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "You were never a ceiling," Marcus said. "You were a person who let someone else convince you that the floor was the ceiling." She didn't answer this. She picked up her mug, now cold, and took it to the sink and stood there for a moment with her back to him, doing nothing except being still. He picked up the compass and put it back in his pocket and left her to it. The legal resolution of Colton Page's fund structure took 11 months from the date of the formal SEC investigation opening. During that period, the fund was frozen, investor assets were placed under court-appointed administration, and the forensic accounting team, Marissa's firm, retained by the SEC for the duration, identified 17 distinct disclosure violations and 3 instances of what was formally classified as material misrepresentation to investors. Colton's cooperation agreement, filed on the 68th day of the investigation, implicated 2 other individuals in the fund's management structure who had participated in the construction of the misleading performance reports. The watch was surrendered as part of an asset liquidation. The Range Rover had been leased, not owned. The lease was in arrears. The Maldives trip, which Colton had referenced at Diane Voss's dinner table with the casual ease of someone for whom international travel was unremarkable, had been charged to the fund's expense account under a classification that Marissa's annotation described. In her forensic report as client entertainment, inadequate documentation, no client identified. The trip had cost $14,200. No client had been present. Of the 340 retail investor accounts in Colton Page's fund, 291 were made at least partially whole through the court-administered recovery process. The remaining 49 had exposure to the fund's most speculative instruments, which had genuinely lost value through market factors rather than fraud, and their recovery was partial. Oliver tracked this for Marcus because Marcus had asked him to, and Oliver reported the final numbers on a call 14 months after the Alderman reception with the precise factual cadence that characterized everything Oliver did. 291 out of 340, Marcus said. Yes, with a weighted average recovery of 74 cents on the dollar for the resolved accounts. Better than the average in cases like this. Marcus did not respond to this with the satisfaction a person might be expected to feel when a situation has resolved more favorably than expected. He felt instead the particular arithmetic of remaining loss, 49 accounts, partial recovery. Real people on the other end of abstract numbers. People who had trusted a performance of confidence and been shortchanged by the gap between the performance and the underlying truth. The SEC appreciated Marissa's supplemental documentation, Oliver said. She may get a call. Good, Marcus said. She should. Part 5 3 months after the Alderman reception. Marcus asked Oliver to arrange a meeting with Creston Capital's full senior management team. There were 11 of them. People who had been with the company for between 4 and 12 years, who had built their professional lives around something they hadn't known they were building around. Because Marcus had maintained his particular privacy with the same consistency inside the company that he maintained it outside. They knew what Creston Capital was, obviously. They knew its size, its performance record, its client relationships. What they had not known, what Marcus had never made explicit in the way that founders sometimes feel the need to make explicit, was the full scope of what their collective work had produced and what he intended to do with that. He gathered them in the main conference room on a Tuesday morning. Oliver was present. Marissa Gentry's full forensic report, now a matter of legal record, was referenced but not circulated. This meeting was not about Colton Page. This meeting was about what came next. Creston Capital has $3 billion under management, Marcus said. You all know that. What I haven't said explicitly enough is that the 4,700 people employed across our portfolio companies are the reason this fund is managed the way it's managed. Conservative positions, long time horizons, no speculative instruments, no surface-level performance signaling that requires us to take on inappropriate risk to maintain. That's been the philosophy since the second fund. I want it codified formally in our investor documentation going forward, not just practiced, but stated. He looked around the table. 11 faces paying the particular attention of people who have been doing good work and are hearing it named. I'm also going to put a formal policy in place, he continued, that any proposed partnership, co-investment, or capital access arrangement that comes through personal rather than institutional channels gets a full Marissa Gentry-level forensic review before it advances. That's a new requirement. It goes in the operating procedures today. He looked at Oliver, who nodded. We were nearly used as a reputational shield for someone else's problem. It didn't succeed. But the vector existed because we didn't have a formal gate on that specific kind of approach. He paused. That's my failure, not anyone else's, he said. I thought that keeping my personal life separate from this work was a sufficient buffer. It wasn't. We're fixing that. No one said anything for a moment. Then Duncan Frey, the COO, who had been with the company for 11 years and who had the careful voice of someone who chooses words with precision, said, the 4,700 figure. You've used it specifically. I use it specifically, Marcus said, because every policy decision we make here is ultimately a decision about whether those 4,700 people have stable employment next year. That's the weight of it. I think it's useful to keep that number in the room. Duncan nodded. Agreed. Anything else? Marcus said. There was a brief, considered silence, the silence of people who have been told a true thing and are sitting with it. The formal policy, said the head of risk compliance, a methodical woman named Jean Calloway who had joined Creston Capital 7 years ago and who Marcus had specifically recruited from a firm where she'd been underutilized. Do you want it drafted through Oliver's office or internally? Collaboratively, Marcus said. Jean, you and Oliver's team? 2 weeks. Done, she said. He thanked them, and the meeting ended, and he sat in the empty conference room for a few minutes after they filed out, alone, in the particular silence of a room that has recently held many people and still carries the warmth of their presence. He took the compass out of his pocket and set it on the conference table and looked at it. His grandfather had used it on water. His father had carried it in his work jacket for 31 years of logistics decisions. Marcus had kept it on a desk, in a pocket, on the hood of a car that belonged to a story he had been living inside for 2 years and 3 months and some additional weeks that he had spent carefully watching the shape of what the story actually was. He had chosen, ultimately, not to do more than justice required. He could have pursued personal civil claims against Serena for the transferred funds. He could have made Colton Page's unraveling more public, more visible, more specifically tied to the social contexts where Colton had built his performance. He could have ensured that Diane Voss understood in detail and on record what her consistent social pressure had built toward. He had done none of these things. Oliver had asked him, once in the period between the reception and the filing, whether he wanted to push further, and Marcus had sat with the question for a day before answering. The 4,700 employees, he said when he called Oliver back, and Serena's 291, the retail investors. If I spend energy on punishment beyond what's legally required, that energy isn't going toward the things that actually matter. The SEC process will do what it's going to do. I don't need to add to it. That's a restrained position, Oliver said. I know, Marcus said. It's the right one, Oliver said. Serena Voss left the apartment on the 1st of the month following the reception. She left without conflict. She was not someone who created conflict as a departure strategy, which had always been one of the things Marcus had genuinely valued about her. She took her things, organized in the practical and systematic way she organized everything. And she left the compass on the kitchen counter because she knew it wasn't hers to take. He found it there the morning after she left, exactly where he had set it down in the middle of their last real conversation, when he'd picked it up and put it back in his pocket, and she had stood at the sink with her back to him. He picked it up and carried it to his desk and set it where it had always been. Turned to face the window. She sent him a message 2 weeks later. It said, I signed what Oliver needed. I talked to the SEC investigator. I'm cooperating fully. I know that's the minimum. I wanted you to know I understand it's the minimum. A pause, then a second message. I'm sorry for the ceiling thing. That was someone else's sentence in my mouth. I should have noticed sooner when I started using other people's sentences. He read this twice and did not respond immediately. When he did respond, the following morning he wrote, I hope what comes next is yours. He meant it without reservation or irony, which is the hardest kind of meaning to arrive at cleanly. Her studio, as far as he knew, was doing well. She had taken on 2 new clients in the months following everything. He heard this through an indirect channel, not by seeking information, withdrawn from her mother's regular Sunday dinners for a period and then resumed them, on different terms she had apparently set herself without negotiation. He didn't know the specifics, and he didn't need them. There is a particular kind of wealth that is not visible because the person who holds it has decided, for reasons that are their own, that performance and possession are not the same thing. Marcus Creston had made that decision after a dinner party at 32 and had held to it across years and a relationship and a test that had produced an answer he had not entirely wanted but had needed to receive. He had built something real, a fund, a team, a responsibility to 4,700 people who came to work every day inside something he had made careful enough to trust. And he had done it while wearing canvas jackets and driving a 7-year-old truck and keeping a brass compass on his desk that had belonged to a man who navigated by instinct as much as instrument. He did not, in the resolution of all of this, feel triumphant. Triumph implies a competition with a winner, and what this had been was closer to a long, difficult act of seeing. Seeing clearly what was there, making choices in the period before anyone else knew those choices were being made, and arriving at a point where what was true had become visible to everyone who needed to see it. If this story has stayed with you, here's what I want to ask you to sit with. Marcus never told Serena what he was worth in order to save the relationship. He also never revealed himself dramatically to punish her. The reveal happened in public because that was the only venue where Colton's access to her also became visible. The ballroom was about Colton as much as it was about anything else. What Marcus chose in every act that followed was to stop exactly where justice stopped and let that be enough. Not forgiveness as performance. Not punishment as satisfaction, just the precise amount of consequence that the situation required, and then a return to the work that actually mattered. The 4,700 workers and the fund they depended on, and the brass compass on the desk that had always found north, regardless of the weather. The grandfather's compass is still on his desk. He has not moved it. He turns it over sometimes when he is sitting with a difficult decision, not for the magic of it, but for the reminder that orientation is possible, that direction exists even when you can't see the horizon, that the instrument that was trusted on open water in bad weather was trusted because it was accurate, not because it was elegant or expensive or obvious from across a room. This is where real stories live. If you found something true in this one, subscribe and we'll tell you another one next week. And if you've ever had to choose between staying quiet and speaking up, between the confrontation that feels right and the patience that proves something, tell us in the comments. We read them all.